In 1862, an archaeologist named Edwin Smith was in the Egyptian city of Luxor when he bought a papyrus from a dealer called Mustafa Aga. This will turn out to be the most important document in the history of medicine. But not appreciating the importance of the papyrus at the time, Smith kept it under wraps all his life. After his death in 1906, his daughter, perhaps not knowing what to do with it, donated the papyrus to the New York Historical Society, where it again lay fallow until 1920. This is when the society asked James Breasted, a highly respected Egyptologist, to translate it. This was a task that took him until 1930 to complete. The Edwin Smith papyrus, as it has since been called, has been housed in the New York Academy of Medicine since 1948, and it tugs at the emotional heartstrings of neurologists. And this is because it contains the earliest written reference to our beloved brain. Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. Here we will continue our exploration of the history of neurology. The last historical podcast, which was also the maiden edition of this podcast, was titled Heritage in Quest of Neurology's Ancestors. There we looked at the beginning of the exploration of the brain from the time of Neolithic man. In this podcast, we will move the theme forward towards the more scientific foundations of our understanding of the brain and of its disorders. And this takes us to the Edwin Smith papyrus, which describes the brain as being similar to the corrugations of molten copper. The papyrus also documents 48 different types of injuries to the head and neck, and it makes medical and surgical treatment recommendations for all these. The Edwin Smith papyrus was written during the Third Egyptian dynasty. This was about 1,000 years after the death of Imhotep, the great Egyptian physician around whom a healing cult developed. Imhotep was a magician physician and also a sage who emerged during the reign of King Zoser, and he rose over the centuries to attain the status of the Egyptian god of medicine. Imhotep's status in medicine is assured not just because he was a skilled physician, but also because he was the earliest physician whose history is available. Some of the signs of Imhotep's greatness are the at least 3 temples which were constructed in his honor, the most famous being at Memphis. The Greeks later called Memphis Asclepion, just as they renamed Imhotep as Imhotep. Talk about takeover. To take the expropriation further, they even integrated him into Aesculapius, their god of medicine. With the decline of Egyptian medicine, it was the Greeks who took the next step in the development of medicine and, of course, of neurology. And the name at the center of this medical advance is Hippocrates. In his book titled Hippocrates, Father of Medicine, Herbert Goldberg reported that Hippocrates was born in the island of Kos in the year 460 BC. After becoming a physician, he left Kos at the age of 30 years to settle in Athens. Hippocrates lived and worked during the so-called peaceful golden age of Pericles, and his illustrious contemporaries included the historian Herodotus, the philosopher Socrates, the playwright Sophocles, and the scientist Democritus. To achieve his breakthroughs, Goldberg said Hippocrates first had to dispel the ritualistic magical medicine that preceded him. And he did this by replacing it with a scientific approach that earned him the title Father of Medicine. Believing that every disease has a specific human and not spiritual cause, Hippocrates successfully established the enduring medical philosophy of close observation and of detailed history taking in the assessment of patients. Rajiv Kurapati also highlighted the contribution of Hippocrates to medicine in his enlightening book titled Physician. Kurapati noted that Hippocrates was the first physician to attempt to separate medicine from philosophy, a feat that distinguished him from preceding physician philosophers such as Pythagoras, Democritus, and Thales. Honing down on the contributions of Hippocrates to neurology, Goldberg wrote that he, Hippocrates, recognized the brain as the most powerful human organ and as the seat of intellect. The direct influence of Hippocrates on neurology is perhaps best illustrated by his approach to epilepsy. Epilepsy was a greatly misunderstood disease that was mired in myths and superstition at the time. But Hippocrates, wise as he was, advocated that it was no more divine or sacred than any other disease. Unfortunately, many of the ideas that Hippocrates entertained about the brain and of the body generally turned out to be wrong. And this is partly because he never took a scalpel to a cadaver. For example, Kurapati wrote that Hippocrates stuck to the erroneous humoral theory of disease that preceded him. The humoral theory states that the human body contains 4 humors: black bile, yellow or red bile, blood, and phlegm, and that each individual possessed a particular humoral makeup. The theory, Kurapati added, advocated that diseases and death result when there's an imbalance of the humors, leading to the deposition of noxious substances. So, whilst Hippocrates did not see medicine as a superstitious practice, and whilst he drew a distinct line between myth and medicine, Kurapati argued that Hippocrates nevertheless did not renounce the power of the gods. After his death in 361 at the age of 99, Goldberg said the science of medicine suffered a setback due to the ineffectual methods of the followers of Hippocrates. He wrote further that as Greek medicine declined, the world center of medicine shifted from Greece back to Egypt. So significant was this decline in Greek medicine that it did not recover until the time of Galen, many centuries later. And of course, it was the Egyptians that took the mantle of medicine during this interregnum, and the physician who advanced our understanding of the body, and particularly of the nervous system at this time, was called Herophilus. Herophilus was born between 330 and 320 BC, and he lived in Alexandria between 335 to 280 BC. He was a student of Praxagoras, who in turn was a pupil of Hippocrates. It was a small medical world. Herophilus was able to make his mark on the history of medicine because he was the first person to study the anatomy of the human body by examining human rather than animal corpses. And he was fortunate to do this because, unlike in Greece where Hippocrates practiced, there were no ethical or religious regulations that restricted human dissection in Alexandria in the early 3rd century BC. Furthermore, the Egyptians also had a long history of embalming the human body after death. Therefore, they did not see dissection of the human body as a taboo. Herophilus was also lucky that the Ptolemies who ruled Egypt then were keen on scientific progress, and Alexandria, their new city, was not bogged down by traditional practices. With these advantages over both his Greek predecessors and successors, Herophilus was able to produce more accurate anatomical works than they could. It is therefore not surprising that the knowledge of the anatomy of the human nervous system that was established by Herophilus was more substantial and more precise than what preceded him. Amongst the novel contributions of Herophilus to medicine were his accurate descriptions of blood vessels, the pulse rate, the liver, the pancreas, and other parts of the human body. And regarding the nervous system, Herophilus is credited with being the first person to describe the brain's internal anatomy and to give an accurate description of the ventricular system. He also recognized the functions of the different parts of the brain, for example, that the hindbrain controls many bodily functions. Furthermore, Herophilus successfully identified the nerves, and he was able to distinguish the motor from the sensory ones, as well as he also described the confluence of the venous sinuses, which now bears his name as the torcular Herophili. Because of the impact Herophilus had on the nervous system, he is considered by many to be the father of neuroanatomy. Unfortunately, the contributions of Herophilus went unrecognized for many centuries. And the reason for this is because he became overshadowed by the authority of Galen, who would make a remarkable contribution to medicine, but who would nevertheless also make numerous errors about the brain and about the human body as a whole. Rajiv Kurapati referred to Galen as the person whose theories became the foundations of authority of all medical writers and physicians, resulting in the establishment of a medical orthodoxy that went undisputed. In his book, Minds Behind the Brain, Stanley Finger also lauded Galen for recognizing and describing in astonishing detail the two parts of the nervous system, the central and the peripheral. It was also Galen, he said, who refuted Aristotle's refrigeration or radiator theory that said the brain's job is to cool the passion of the heart. Galen also corrected Aristotle's mistaken opinion that the nerves originated from the heart. Indeed, he punctured quite a few holes in the so-called cardiocentric view of intellect, the idea that the heart was the center of reason. According to Andrew Pickens in his book, A History of the Brain, it is such feats of scientific clarity that earned Galen the title the earliest neuroscientist. Although Galen was correct about the brain being the true organ of mind, his mistaken ideas about the brain unfortunately overshadowed his contributions. For example, according to Stanley Finger, Galen erroneously believed that strokes resulted either from an accumulation of thick, cold humor in the ventricles or from a rush of cool blood to the head. Galen's errors arose mainly because his anatomical knowledge came entirely from the dissection of animals such as apes, insights that he wrongly ascribed to humans. Unfortunately, Galen's wrong ideas held strong for centuries after his death in 199 or 200 AD. Such was his influence on the subsequent course of medicine that Finger said Galen's thoughts about the brain and behavior were treated as dogma. And so it remained until the emergence of the Flemish physician Andreas Vesalius. The medical historian Stephen Joff referred to Vesalius as the most influential anatomist of the 16th century. In his biography of the man titled Andreas Vesalius, Joff wrote that Vesalius started his medical education at the age of 19 in the University of Paris, an institution whose academic culture was steeped in the Galenic tradition. Vesalius, however, had to leave France in his third year of medical school when the threat of war between France and the Roman Empire loomed. He returned to the University of Louvain in his home country of Belgium to continue his medical training, and from there he proceeded to the University of Padua in Italy to take up the prestigious position of professor of surgery. As he gained fame by his brilliant dissection of human bodies, Vesalius accepted the task of updating and editing the Latin translations of 3 of Galen's books, a step that Joff referred to as the turning point in the history of anatomy. In undertaking this work, Joff said Vesalius repeatedly found himself confronted with contradictions between what he believed to be true and what he saw before him. These contradictions led him to extend his studies of Galen's works. And in 1541, after his exhaustive research, Vesalius published his magnum opus, De Humani Corporis Fabrica. Published in 1543 when he was only 28 years old, Joff enthused that the Fabrica changed the world forever because it showed the human body as it had never before been imagined. Consisting of 7 books and almost 700 pages and more than 200 illustrations, Joff said Vesalius had intended the Fabrica to be a masterpiece and that it remains the material testimony to a unique collaboration in the history of art and medicine. And it was in this masterpiece that Joff said Vesalius refuted many of Galen's original anatomical theories. Vesalius used the Fabrica to build on Galen's work, but also to examine Galen's work in the light of evidence obtained through hands-on dissections. Vesalius, Joff added, aimed to empirically confirm and expand on Galen's theories, if true, and to correct and clarify his theories when objective evidence suggested they were not accurate. And according to Kurapati, in this way, Galen successfully debunked about 200 of Galen's wrong teachings. And relevant to neurology was his finding that the nerves were not hollow structures and that there is no network of blood vessels at the base of the brain called the reti mirabile. This was something which Galen said generated animal spirits. Although Vesalius eventually succeeded in dethroning Galen from his impossibly high pedestal, this was not without resistance from the medical establishment of the time. Indeed, one of the most vociferous critics of Vesalius was his anatomy teacher in Paris, Jacobus Sylvius. But the paradigm eventually shifted and scientific anatomy took hold. In the next episode of this podcast, I'll be speaking to Susan Martin, author of the book titled The Prince of Medicine, to examine Galen's contributions to both medicine and neurology. And after that, to discuss the different concepts that have evolved about the brain over time, I'll be speaking to Matthew Cobb, author of The Idea of the Brain. If you found this podcast enlightening, you may consider subscribing to the Neuro Checklist website for more up-to-date evidence of neurological advances and for more of the layperson's view of neurology. You might consider reading my book, Surfing the Brain. And why not subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube channels to ensure you do not miss the next episode of the podcast in conversation with Susan Martin. Thank you very much for your time.